By the late 1810s of the Common Era, British colonisation in Australia had moved beyond its initial centres. New South Wales was no longer a frontier outpost struggling to survive. It had become a base from which expansion radiated outward. Roads extended inland, stock routes opened, and new districts were surveyed with speed and confidence. The logic of invasion, established around Sydney, now governed the continent. Expansion was driven by land hunger. Sheep pastoralism expanded rapidly after 1815 of the Common Era. Wool became a valuable export, tying Australian land directly to British industry. Large tracts were claimed by officers, free settlers, and newly arrived migrants. The scale of occupation increased dramatically. Where earlier settlement had been cautious and clustered, the new phase was fast, expansive, and often unregulated. This expansion crossed Aboriginal boundaries without negotiation. Survey lines cut across country that had been governed for millennia by law, kinship, and obligation. Rivers, plains, and mountain passes were claimed through maps and proclamations rather than agreement. Aboriginal systems of land use were dismissed as incompatible with ownership. Presence became trespass overnight. Violence followed the frontier. As settlers moved into the Bathurst Plains and beyond the Blue Mountains after 1816 of the Common Era, resistance intensified. Aboriginal groups responded by attacking isolated homesteads, driving off livestock, and defending access to water and hunting grounds. These were acts of survival, not lawlessness. Yet colonial authorities consistently framed them as criminal attacks. In response, the colonial state expanded its coercive power. Military detachments, mounted police, and armed settlers conducted punitive expeditions across newly occupied regions. These operations were rarely documented in detail. Casualties among Aboriginal people were underreported or ignored entirely. Settler deaths were recorded meticulously, reinforcing the narrative of danger and justification. The pattern repeated across regions. In Van Diemen's Land, British settlement intensified after 1803 of the Common Era, culminating in full-scale frontier war during the 1820s. In what would later become Victoria, squatting expanded rapidly during the 1830s of the Common Era, bringing violent dispossession to Aboriginal nations across the Port Phillip district. Queensland followed with similar intensity in the mid-19th century of the Common Era, as pastoral expansion pushed northward. Colonisation advanced through repetition rather than adaptation. Wherever settlers arrived, the same assumptions applied. Land was claimed, resistance was criminalized, and violence was used to enforce possession. The absence of treaties or formal declarations of war did not limit force. It enabled it. The frontier was defined not by borders, but by the reach of colonial authority. Administrative structures kept pace with expansion. New districts were proclaimed. Magistrates were appointed. Police forces were established to secure settler interests. Aboriginal people remained excluded from legal protection. They could not testify in court, could not claim land, and could not seek redress for violence committed against them. Law functioned as reinforcement, not restraint. By the 1830s of the Common Era, British colonisation had become continental in ambition. Expansion was no longer reactive. It was planned, incentivised, and expected. The frontier wars that erupted across Australia were not anomalies. They were the inevitable consequence of a system designed to replace indigenous sovereignty with imperial control. The continent was being reshaped through force and administration working together. What began in New South Wales had become a model applied across Australia, transforming diverse regions into variations of the same colonial structure. By the 1830s of the Common Era, British colonisation in Australia entered a new phase defined by speed and scale. This phase was driven by squatting, the occupation of land without legal title. Squatters moved livestock onto Aboriginal country ahead of surveys, courts, and administration. Their presence was illegal in theory and encouraged in practice. The colonial state tolerated squatting because it served imperial interests. Wool exports expanded rapidly during the 1830s and 1840s of the Common Era. Pastoral profits flowed to Britain, strengthening economic ties between colony and metropole. Large flocks required vast grazing lands, and Aboriginal country provided them. The law adapted to expansion rather than restraining it. What began as unlawful occupation was later legalized through leases and grants. This process was violent by design. Squatters established homesteads in remote regions, often far from colonial oversight. When Aboriginal groups resisted, settlers responded with force. Firearms, poison, and mounted patrols were used to clear land. These acts were rarely prosecuted. Isolation ensured impunity. Silence ensured continuity. Across the Port Phillip district in the 1830s of the Common Era, frontier violence became routine. Aboriginal resistance was met with massacres that went unrecorded or were deliberately minimized in official correspondence. Settler narratives framed these events as unfortunate necessities. Aboriginal voices were excluded entirely. Queensland followed a similar trajectory. As pastoral expansion moved northward during the 1840s and 1850s of the Common Era, violence escalated further. The establishment of the native police force institutionalized coercion. Comprised largely of Aboriginal troopers under white officers, the force conducted raids that resulted in widespread death and displacement. This was not frontier chaos. It was organized enforcement. The colonial state refined its tools. Legal exclusion remained central. Aboriginal people were denied the right to testify in court against Europeans. This single rule ensured that most violence would never reach trial. Settlers understood this clearly. The absence of accountability shaped behavior more effectively than any proclamation. Maps replaced presents. Surveyors translated country into lines, blocks, and leases. Rivers became boundaries. Sacred sites disappeared beneath legal descriptions. This administrative transformation severed land from memory and law, replacing relationship with ownership. Once mapped, land could be sold, taxed, inherited, and defended with force. Resistance persisted despite overwhelming odds. Aboriginal groups adapted tactics, avoided open confrontation, and targeted supply lines. Knowledge of terrain remained a powerful advantage. Yet the asymmetry of power grew with every decade. Firearms improved. Communication networks expanded. Colonial populations increased. The frontier compressed Aboriginal space until survival itself became resistance. By the mid-19th century of the Common Era, the machinery of dispossession was fully operational across much of the continent. Squatting had become settlement. Settlement had become law. Violence had become background. Understanding this phase is essential to understanding Australia itself. If you want more historically grounded explanations like this, without simplification or myth, subscribe the channel. By the middle of the 19th century of the Common Era, British colonisation in Australia had matured into a coherent continental system. What had once appeared as scattered frontier conflicts were now recognizable as interconnected phases of the same process. Expansion, resistance, and repression followed a predictable sequence across regions, regardless of local differences. This was no longer improvisation. It was policy without proclamation. Across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and Western Australia, colonisation advanced through a shared logic. Pastoralists moved first, occupying land ahead of formal authority. Violence followed when Aboriginal groups resisted. Colonial governments then arrived to stabilize the situation, not by restoring justice, but by legalizing the outcome. Law did not precede conquest. It ratified it. In the Port Phillip district, which would later become Victoria, this pattern was especially visible during the 1830s and 1840s of the Common Era. Squatters occupied vast areas with minimal oversight. Aboriginal resistance was widespread and determined. In response, massacres occurred at sites that would later be minimized, denied, or forgotten. Official inquiries were rare, and when conducted, they focused on settler losses rather than Aboriginal deaths. Queensland represented the most extreme application of this system. From the 1840s through the 1870s of the Common Era, pastoral expansion pushed relentlessly northward. The native police force became the primary instrument of control. Its operations were mobile, militarized, and lethal. Villages were destroyed. People were shot while fleeing. Survivors were driven into marginal lands or forced into labor. The frontier was not pacified through agreement, but through exhaustion and terror. Western Australia followed a parallel path. British settlement expanded outward from the Swan River colony after 1829 of the Common Era. As elsewhere, land was seized without treaty. Resistance was met with punitive expeditions. Aboriginal leaders were imprisoned, executed, or exiled. The same asymmetry of power defined outcomes across thousands of kilometers. Despite regional variation, the underlying structure remained constant. Aboriginal sovereignty was never acknowledged. Violence against Aboriginal people was rarely punished. Settler expansion was framed as progress. Resistance was criminalized. These principles formed the foundation of British Australia, embedding frontier war into the fabric of colonial society. By the late 19th century of the Common Era, overt frontier violence began to decline in many regions. This was not because justice had been achieved, but because Aboriginal populations had been displaced, reduced, or confined. Missions, reserves, and government controls replaced open warfare. The system evolved, but its purpose remained unchanged. The wars did not end. They changed form. What makes this period critical is not only the scale of violence, but its invisibility. Frontier wars were not commemorated. They were not taught as wars. They were absorbed into administrative language, pastoral records, and local memory, fragmented and often silenced. By the time Australia moved toward federation at the end of the 19th century, colonisation had succeeded in its primary objective. Indigenous control over land had been broken across most of the continent. The cost of this outcome was neither accidental nor marginal. It was foundational. Understanding British colonisation requires recognising this system for what it was: a prolonged, decentralised war conducted without declaration, fought through expansion, law, and force. The modern Australian state emerged not alongside this process, but from it.